1, 2. Good morning. I'm Oliver Greenwood, Contra Costa Bar Association President. On behalf of the Contra Costa County Bar Association, I would like to welcome you to the 26th Annual MCLE Spectacular. And this morning's session, Practice Competently, Calm Your Brain, Regain Your Focus. I hope your morning is off to a spectacular start. Weren't the criminal section and the litigation section programs fabulous? This afternoon, after Novella Coleman's keynote, I'm looking forward to visiting the section networking rooms, the sponsors' virtual booths, and learning some great tips at the Live Law Firm Marketing Forum. I hope you will join me. Then, at 4 p.m., there will be some more MCLE sessions. And finally, at 6 p.m., on our main stage, some entertainment. I may even be doing some prestidigitation, performing some feats of legerdemain, and showing some sleight of hand. I got that backwards. That's the direction I was looking for. Our event and program sponsors are a very important part of our CCCBA community. They make it possible for us to provide events like this. Please support us by supporting them. At this time, I would like to introduce our speaker, Michelle Galloway. Michelle Galloway is of counsel to Cooley's litigation department. Michelle joined Cooley in August 1993 and was a partner of the firm from January 1997 through April 2000. She now serves as of counsel at Cooley while also teaching at Stanford and Santa Clara law schools. I will now pass the stage over to Michelle so we can all learn how to practice competently. Michelle?
Thank you, Oliver. Well, good morning. I wanted to take the time today to talk to you about the legal profession and stress and how that impacts us. We were already working in a profession known for its stress before 2020 happened, and so I really want to think about it in a proactive way, both acknowledging sort of what has happened in the past 6 months that has made legal practice more challenging, how that may be impacting us in terms of competently providing legal services to our clients, and then really talk about some concrete steps that we can take to manage stress and burnout in the profession as we look to the longer term. Because if we don't make time for our wellness to make sure that we have sort of the cognitive, mental, emotional, physical fortitude to be able to continue practicing, then at some point there will be a time where we're at risk for sort of dropping the ball, and that's what we want to try to avoid. So I want to start by talking about what you may already know about stress in the legal profession, which is that lawyers suffer. And the research on this has been very consistent across the past 25 years of research studies done by different organizations about lawyer well-being. And so this is a study published in 2016 that looked at lawyer well-being in a number of different dimensions and found that, for example, 1/3 of lawyers qualify as problem drinkers. 21 to 36% of us problem drinkers, 36% using alcohol. Tends to be higher for those in private practice and especially solo practitioners. And that's one of the things you'll see throughout this research study is that often it was solo practitioners who don't have sort of, maybe haven't thought about having a built-in backstop of somebody who can help them when they are busy, when they need to step away from their practice for a few days, can be particularly vulnerable. And that's probably more so during this current pandemic. Depression. Lawyers as a profession suffer from depression. About 28% report symptoms of depression. The general rule of thumb in most studies have found that lawyers suffer from depression at a rate about double that of the general population, meaning that there's something either about who is attracted to law practice or something about the structures of law practice itself that contribute to a much higher than expected rate of depression among attorneys. 23% report symptoms of stress, 19% report symptoms of anxiety, and among the professions, we're within the top 10 in terms of suicide. And again, that is higher than the national average would be. I think that's an area of particular concern because that is one area not reflected on this slide where it actually are more men and more men that are in sort of that 45 to 65 kind of age range that suffer suicide at a greater rate in this profession. So, you know, it's sort of distressing information. The ABA, along with the Hazelton Betty Ford Foundation, published a study in 2016 that was specifically focused on lawyers and reached similar conclusions as the study that I just shared with you, reporting you know, sort of similar rates of depression and anxiety. What they found is that younger attorneys in their first 10 years of practice tended to exhibit more issues around substance abuse or the higher rates of depression and anxiety. That's consistent with other research that's been done that shows sort of as people are longer in their careers, 7, 8 years out from law school graduation, you do begin to see some of the anxiety and depression and substance abuse sort of level out. And yet it continues at these rates nearly double what we would see if we were chosen different career paths. I think this is particularly challenging in the current environment. You know, one is to remember that not only do we have a duty of competence, which we're going to speak to, but we also have obligations as supervisory attorneys. So for those of us who find ourselves in positions where we are supervising either other lawyers or non-lawyer staff, we have obligations to make sure that they also are, you know, providing services commensurate with our obligation to practice competently. And so there are some things that we might particularly look for that might raise concerns about whether somebody is sort of in this environment of depression, anxiety, burnout, where perhaps we need to do something more to support them. And generally, as we look at ourselves and we look at others, one of the first signs would be sort of a behavior change, a delta, where something is different than it used to be. Now, that's really difficult in 2020 where so many things are different, but it's sort of watching for those now. Some of the physical things we might have seen if we were in environments where we were working closely together, you know, slurred speech, signs of fatigue, bloodshot eyes, are much more difficult perhaps to see in remote environments. So it may be very important for us to listen more and be more observant, especially during virtual meetings. So things like somebody being short-tempered, they suddenly have difficulty concentrating. You notice that, you know, sort of when you make a comment to them, they don't respond because their mind has wandered elsewhere. They're exhibiting sort of cynicism, or there are big productivity changes. Could also be indicators that somebody is sort of on that path, or they're becoming more stressed, more burned out. That, of course, is also challenging in this environment because people's productivity may be falling for totally unrelated reasons, in the sense that they're now, for example, caretakers or caregivers, or they're having to educate young children at home. So there are lots of things that could be impacting productivity other than the kinds of challenges reflected in that earlier work. At some points, it switches over to burnout. And this is an area where I've seen less written about the attorney or legal environment, although there's much being written out in industry as a whole. And that is, many companies found that there's sort of burnout early in the shelter in place, where everything was changing and people were sort of trying to get their feet under them about this new work environment. But much is being written now about sort of burnout 2.0, where they're discovering that now that people are recognizing that things will not return to, I use air quotes, normal in 3 or 4 weeks or in 3 or 4 months, that they're starting to experience that sense of exhaustion again. Many companies in the private sector have been quite proactive in noticing things. For example, many companies were reporting that by May and June, most employees had taken 2 or fewer days of vacation during 2020. So many companies started instituting mandatory holidays during the summer months to try to get people to take a break, where if everybody in the company had the day off, then nobody had to worry they were missing out or would somehow be at a disadvantage from taking the time off. Many organizations also started booking specific times that were no meeting times. So times when employees would know that they would have a block of time where their colleagues would not be scheduling meetings, where they could do the things that they needed to do, either for work or at home. And so, although there's a lot out there in the non-legal environment, I've seen less in terms of things being published about what firms are doing or individual lawyers are doing to address this second wave of burnout. I do think this is an area where we need to be much more attuned to the kinds of statements that people are making as one of the primary ways that we might detect this kind of burnout or stress. And that is when people start talking about nothing I do is effective. I can't move this deal forward. When they start making statements that show that they don't feel they have effectiveness or they're not making accomplishment, doing things that they expected to be able to do, again, there can be other reasons, but that's sort of one of those red flags that perhaps somebody's entering a sort of state of exhaustion where they're no longer sort of cognitively accurate in their perception about what they're being able to do. And you'll sometimes also start hearing them make comments about feelings of lost identity, that they don't feel like a lawyer or they don't feel like they're making a contribution to a case or a client or a firm. And so starting to really listen for some of those statements, reflecting sort of that feeling that they are not as productive, efficient, impactful as they once were, are going to be really important for us to be attuned to during this time. The ABA, as part of that study back in 2016, created a website that has an incredible number of resources in this particular area. And so if you were to Google this and go to this website, you would find that they looked at lawyer well-being on a number of different criteria, everything from sort of intellectual, physical, social, emotional. And what they did is they created different toolkits and recommendations for if you were practicing in a firm environment, a government environment, a judicial environment, as well as worksheets that you could work on as individual lawyers. So this is a great resource if you wanted to start understanding or doing some self-reflection, or if you're in a leadership position where you're supervising others, then this is a great place to start some of that work and research. And then one of the other areas that wasn't captured in the 2016 research, but was part of a study that was released in 2018 that I think is particularly challenging is research on loneliness. So I suspect that for many of you, if I were to ask you, would you be willing to start smoking 15 cigarettes a day? You would probably decline because you're aware of the health considerations in doing so. But in 2018, a new research study came out about the physiological impacts of feeling of loneliness on individuals. And what they found were that the physical effects, the healthcare outcomes and effects of loneliness were equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And in that research, the loneliest profession were lawyers, and that was followed by engineers and scientists. And so this wasn't captured in that ABA research, but I think a really important one for us to think about because for many lawyers, especially so many lawyers who practice either as solos or in small firm environments, that loneliness may be amplified. And it may be especially amplified for all lawyers right now. Because while many people have maintained sort of their first level connections with the people to whom they were closest, a colleague, their family, a neighbor, most of us have lost those secondary connections, the casual, how are you doing, in a hallway, or saying hi to the person who has the office, down the hall from us. And so a lot of those secondary human interactions are missing, which has its own impact on making us feel lonely. And then for many individuals, what I find is that we're very focused, especially on issues around people who are having to parent young children and maybe having to essentially help with their education right now when schools are closed. But one thing I've seen less attention to are the number of people who are sheltering in place alone. And I think one way to think about that is of our 5 senses, the largest organ we have is actually our skin, that sort of tactile touch. And so for many people who've been in basically isolation now for 6 months, they really haven't had that experience. And so I think it's not surprising that many people have decided to adopt pets, which gives you that sort of tactile interaction with something that's alive and breathing, and gardening, which also has that high tactile concentration, are two things that have been extremely popular. So is bread making, and again, extremely tactile if you're working with yeast breads. So I think that we need to keep our eye on this loneliness factor, that we may not fully recognize how difficult that is for a number of lawyers in this profession who actually do not have that regular and prolonged contact with others that some of us may have as a result of working in firms, or perhaps we're sheltering in place with a large number of people in our family. How this plays into competence, I've given this quite a bit of thought, and I think we're supposed to have the legal knowledge, the skill, the thoroughness of preparation necessary for the representation. And so it's against that backdrop that you start to then look at, well, with substance abuse, with anxiety and depression, as those begin to affect our cognitive resources, the very thing that we pride ourselves on as lawyers, that ability for analytic thinking, then we start to really call into question, sort of our ability to practice competently. And I can think of two areas in particular that I think are essential for lawyers where that is really hit hard. And the first is decision making. That a lot of what we do as lawyers is present clients with alternatives, assessment of risk, alternatives that are available to them. And it's a collaborative process of presenting those options and the client reaching a decision that we can then begin to implement with our legal strategies. And so if we're depleted in our ability to think about that analytically, to think creatively, because we are somehow self-medicating through substance abuse, or we are suffering from depression or anxiety or loneliness, then we are less able to help make those presentations to clients as communications that would allow them to reach sort of optimal decisions. And the other aspect is that a lot of practicing law is having extremely difficult conversations with our own clients, with opposing counsel, with courts or regulatory bodies. And so again, when we're sort of firing on all cylinders, we have sort of maximum capacity to think on our feet, to communicate effectively, because we're in our prefrontal cortex, our thinking brain. That's one thing, we're practicing competently. But again, as we fall into those areas where we're struggling individually, then those difficult discussions become much, much harder, because we're no longer in our prefrontal cortex, but sliding into our limbic system, the older part of our brain, the emotional brain. And so these are two areas specifically that are so essential for great client relations, for trust, for helping to make sure clients are getting the optimal outcome, that can be negatively affected by lawyers who are struggling and suffering with these other types of health and wellness challenges. I think the other aspect, in addition to competence, is diligence. It's a rule that you don't hear about all that often, but we have an obligation to act with reasonable promptness in representing a client. And one of the challenges is that as people burn out, as they are suffering from depression or anxiety, they will often begin to procrastinate, right? They don't feel that they've got the capacity to start on that tough project. They feel depleted. They're not working as efficiently, so there's a risk that bills are going up. And one of the specific things that the comments to the rule point out is that there's no professional shortcoming more widely resented than procrastination. And I think this is one that is so important for us to think about, that as we are depleted, it becomes harder to do things in a timely way, to do things in the most efficient way that would help a client. And so another reason why we need to both examine ourselves and be self-aware about where we are as we decide whether to take on additional work or to ask others to help us. And at the same time, if we're supervising others, really noticing at the front end when we're starting to see challenges in that particular area. And then finally, one of the important things in the attorney-client relationship is communication. And we're supposed to reasonably consult with the client about the means by which we're to accomplish their objectives, but also keeping clients reasonably informed. And again, as we begin to seed from our cognitive brain into that limbic system, that more emotional brain, where we're more reactive and less responsive, communication with our clients can become a serious sort of casualty of that we're reluctant to keep clients informed. And I think especially right now, where sometimes we feel that the news we're bringing is not welcome news because of all the different issues happening financially in the world, and all of the constant changing of laws and regulations trying to deal with this pandemic. Often when we're talking to clients, it's about things that are very emotionally charged and very difficult. And so if we pull back from communication, we can also sort of be on the wrong side of model rule 1.4. So just a number of areas where it's important for competent practice that we make sure that we have those resources necessary for our cognitive brains to be able to present and perform our best work. The other area, to be candid, where I think you traditionally see issues anytime there is a recession, has been lawyers beginning to take on matters that exceed sort of their legal knowledge. And that's always a concern at times like this as well, that lawyers stretch themselves both in terms of volume of work, but also may stretch themselves into areas where they don't have that requisite knowledge and may find themselves down the road facing either malpractice case or disciplinary action. And so really important to sort of keep our eye on that as we continue to move through this. I did want to make sure that and every slide I'm showing you is going to be part of the resources that you can download. You can absolutely email or call me at any time if there's something I'm talking about that is a particular interest to you. But I put 3 resources right here, one starting with the ABA and that toolkit. This link will take you right to that research study and all of the resources that they gathered from a number of professionals to help make recommendations to lawyers, firms, and judges about how to improve lawyer wellness. The California Lawyers Association, I am a member of the Litigation Sections Executive Committee, but the California Lawyers Association as a whole has a Health and Wellness Committee, and you can go to their website. They have a number of resources and different programs as well that are available to California lawyers. And then separate from the California Lawyers Association, the State Bar, the agency responsible for lawyer licensing, has a lawyer assistance program, again, for people who are struggling with their practice, whether it's good management practices, dealing with client funds. They can help you to establish better practices or get assistance to keep your practice functioning in the way that it should. So there are a number of resources out there, and of course, as always, the challenge is getting individuals to ask for the help that they need. And so I'd like to sort of pivot and sort of think about both why, as humans, we are particularly stressed, but also why 2020 brings special challenges that may require us to pivot and ask for help in places that we might not have done so before. So believe it or not, stress, one of the most important things about stress is what you think about it. Do you think that it's good for you, or do you think that it's harmful to you? And so I want to try to approach this by talking about one of my favorite books, which is Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. So zebras do not get ulcers, humans do. And I want to talk a little bit about what that is that's happening that differentiates humans from other species. And so if you posit, sort of a zebra out on the savannah, this zebra is grazing for lunch. It is not under any stress. Its environment right now, it's eating. It might be, it's pumping blood, it's breathing, different systems are working in different ways. It's not under any stress. But at any moment, it may suddenly detect a stressor in the environment. So in this case, let's posit a predator, whether the zebra smells the predator, hears the rustling in the grass, suddenly a predator enters that environment. And the news for the zebra is most of those predators can only run as fast as a zebra for about 45 to 60 seconds. So what happens is for 45 to 60 seconds, that zebra has to try to pump as much oxygenated blood as it can to its legs so that it can outrun the predator for 45 to 60 seconds. So basically the zebra shuts down any non-essential systems other than respiration and circulation. It runs flat out. And 45 seconds later, that intense stress is over for the zebra. And not to put too fine a point on it, but within 1 minute, that zebra is either back to eating its lunch or it is lunch for some other creature. So that zebra is under intense episodic stress for 1 minute, and then it goes back to its relatively stress-free environment. And the difference here is that that zebra did not willingly put itself under stress. It was under stress for an extremely short period of time. And then it goes back to what is likely a long period without stress. Humans are the only known organism that deliberately puts itself under stress for prolonged periods of time. And so, and by the nature of law practice in particular, with sort of unrelenting deadlines, with, you know, the need for sort of extremely close attention to detail, so that mistakes are not made that could cost somebody either jail time or money in terms of damages. You know, lawyers are under prolonged stress on a sort of continuous basis, and that's extremely different than other animal species. So humans, you know, if you want to think about it, the oldest part of our brain, the brainstem, responsible for pumping our blood, for causing us to breathe. So fortunately, we don't have to think about any of this. The next oldest part of our brain is the emotional or limbic system. And the limbic system is dominated by the amygdala, which was designed to detect threats. So it's that thing that lets that zebra know there's a predator. I can hear it, I can smell it, there's something that's changed in my environment. That response is extremely strong, and humans have that, right? For most of us, we have a very strong response to different stressors in the environment. And the three that are most common are sort of fight or aggression, anger, flee, which many people will describe as sort of depression, running away from the problem, turning the worry inward, or freezing. And some people would analogize that to anxiety, sort of, you know, being stuck, if you will. And so we have these reactions, but they're not necessarily well adapted for a lawyer who's trying to give great legal advice to a client. And so the question is, you know, can we think about stress in sort of a different way so that we increase our repertoire of responses, and so that they are not reactive, but they're responsive to a specific situation? The first piece of that, I think, is acknowledging that the stress that you are feeling in 2020 is very different than the stress you had last year and the previous years of your practice. The way I think about it is I think back to New Year's Eve, and all I can say is I did not see that plot twist coming. I did not see the plot twist that was 2020, you know, sort of on the horizon in a meaningful way. And the important thing to remember is when sort of COVID hit, your existing stressors did not vanish. Instead, we added to them. And so you could think about it in any number of ways. You know, first, there was sort of the pandemic and the health issue, right? So real concern about our physical well-being, the ability for hospitals to meet demand to treat people who have COVID-19. That sort of carried us through March, through April, into May. And then near the end of May, we had the killing of George Floyd. And it created a new energy and urgency to addressing racial injustice issues in the United States. It has also resulted in some definite racial trauma, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, but it became another significant stressor in addition to COVID. The economic toll that's happening, right? So the beginning, you know, the huge number of people who lost employment, you know, concerns about whether people will be able to be fully employed again, people worried about their insurance coverage. Natural disasters in California, a huge factor, obviously, in the western states again this year have been the wildfires. And now with the election on the horizon, you know, another major stressor. And in many presentations, I find these are about equally weighted by people in terms of which are, you know, sort of top of mind for them. And I think one other just overarching thing is that one thing that's happened in the past 6 months has been sort of a colossal loss of privacy for many people, meaning that suddenly there were people living in our homes that we might not have lived with for a long period of time, or some people who are essentially strangers to us. Suddenly we didn't have a place. You couldn't retreat to your office as a place to get away from family, or to home as a way to get away from coworkers. And in fact, with the move to work from home, suddenly lots of my coworkers were basically in my home office with me. And so, very different environment. So there were a number of stressors that were added on to the existing stress that you had as a practicing lawyer. Those changes, many of us suddenly found ourselves in roles as educators and caretakers for which we had not planned, hadn't expected to. We suddenly have sort of competing demands in at home, because home is now a place of both work and relaxation. The very nature of video conferencing has its own set of challenges with stress that are sort of well documented. And one thing about having a lot of people at home together is stress is contagious. There's actually some very interesting research that's been done about this, where people are sort of absorbing stress from the people around them. My job might not be stressful, but hearing a child or a spouse on their phone calls dealing with their work may increase our stress levels. So I think there are a number of different ways in which those changes at home and at work have added stress to the existing positions of lawyers. And of course, for many of us, real challenges about meeting all of our ethical obligations around confidentiality in this work from home environment. So, a number of different changes. How do we know that these are increasing stresses? I can give you plenty of statistics, but two of them are dentists have seen a huge surge in the number of people coming in with cracked teeth, which is most likely a result of teeth grinding that's happening. And there are many studies showing many disruptions in sleep of both children and adults right now. Does seem to be more prevalent in women than in men. So we know that the sort of combined effect is negatively impacting both physical, mental, and emotional health. And then, there are many societal changes that have also had profound impacts. I think a lot about, missing milestones that all cultures share around celebrating, birth, graduation, wedding, acknowledging death, that have been taken away. So a lot of grieving around those, and obviously a substantial amount of grief and concern around racial injustice issues. I think one of the things that's important to recognize is you're not alone. One of the most insidious parts of profound stress, depression, and anxiety is the feeling that it's just me, because we're comparing our insides, how we feel, to how other people look. And in terms of we're comparing our insides to their outsides. And I really want you to try to shake that. If you're doing that, don't. 1/3 of all American adults say they've experienced high levels of psychological distress during the coronavirus outbreak. Just to sort of break it down, and I know this may be hard to see, you may want to blow it up on the PDF, but many people are reporting high levels of distress, that they're both anxious and depressed. But I think that last column, 1 in 4 American adults are reporting they're binge drinking at least once a week. 1 in 5 admit that they're taking prescription medications for non-medical reasons. 1 in 7 using illicit or illegal drugs. And that tells us that people are suffering. It's not just us, but they're choosing ways to deal with it that are not healthy or helpful in the long run. And so really trying to focus on choosing more wisely, which is going to be the last part of our discussion today. I do want to highlight that if you're a person of color, if you are working with people of color, it's well documented that there are stressors related to race, that people who are members of groups who've experienced prejudice and discrimination, they often have greater negative health issues. And that has been especially borne out during this pandemic. COVID has disproportionately had health impacts on people of color in terms of severity and likelihood of contracting the disease. Now we're starting to see that spill over into the educational environment, where many people of color are not able to afford the kinds of alternatives to schools that wealthier families are able to engage in. And then also with racial injustice, there's a post-traumatic stress for many people who have experienced racial traumas in the past, and a renewed focus on sort of systemic or structural racism. And so I think really important to acknowledge that for many people, there's more than one thing that is negatively impacting their well-being right now in substantial ways. Natural disasters are another source of trauma. So 10 to 30% of wildfire survivors develop a diagnosable medical condition. And obviously, this has been a huge issue on an almost annual basis here in the West for the past 4 years. And that substance abuse and domestic violence rise after natural disasters. And that's an area that we haven't touched on yet, but most of the research is suggesting that there have, in all likelihood, the prediction is there have been increases in domestic violence in the United States during this time, but because people are so isolated, we're not able to sort of see or recognize individuals who are being either neglected or abused. And so there's grave concern around that in a number of quarters. I also just want to highlight, I'm fortunate to know I've lived in California almost all my adult life. I know a lot of lawyers in Contra Costa County. Many of us have practices that bring us in touch with people who are suffering. And so secondary trauma to lawyers who are assisting people who themselves are suffering has been well documented in the literature, and makes it all the more imperative that we make sure we're engaged in self-care so that we are best able to help others. And that's very important during this time. I think just sort of a final note on this before we leave, sort of why is this different in 2020? To me, we could think about Maslow's hierarchy of human needs, and that what we need are air, water, food, followed by sort of employment, health, followed by love and belonging. All of these are in jeopardy in 2020 in quite different and unique ways, and all at the same time. One of the reasons that you may feel particularly uneasy during 2020 is that two parts of your brain are sending you conflicting signals about what you should do to avoid the threats that they pose. And I'll use this example, right? The older part of our brain, that amygdala that detects threats, knows that when humans are under threat, the general rule of thumb for centuries has been get together with other people, right? We band together with our tribe, our village, our city, our nation, get with other people, because together we can better meet our needs, right? And that's grounded in the fact that human infants can't survive without sort of the care of other humans. But at the same time, your prefrontal cortex, your thinking analytic brain, is telling you, I'm hearing what's happening with these issues, and I need to stay away from people as a way to help prevent the spread of COVID-19 and try to keep myself and my family safe. And so it's one of the first times where two different parts of your brain are sending you competing signals: get with other people, get away from other people. And that's one reason that you may feel particularly uneasy during this year, is because the brain doesn't have a clear way to choose between those two parts of the brain sending those signals. I want to give you two different ideas about what also is happening. One is to really think about 2020 as a year of profound grief. That we're essentially grieving many things that we expected we would have this year that we will not. And so, if you're familiar at all with Kubler-Ross work on the grief cycle, that that's essentially what many of us are going through this year. I've been thinking particularly about James Stockdale, who was a prisoner of war. And one of the things that he talked about was the Stockdale Paradox, that the people who were sort of the best able, the most resilient to get through being a prisoner of war were those who were brutally honest about how difficult reality was, right? They didn't shirk it. They were very upfront and clear about how dangerous their situation was, but they had long-term optimism. And I think that that's something that I'd encourage you to really give some thought to, because I think that's one thing we're finding is a lot of people had a very short-term view of what was likely to happen, the disruption being quite short in duration. And now that it's not only going to be longer term, but combined with all of these other things that have happened in 2020, one is to be brutally honest that, this is really hard and really unprecedented, but at the same time, in the long term, right? And in the 2-year horizon, most of these things will be resolved and hopefully resolved successfully. So that may be another way of starting to think about this, which is really trying to sort of lengthen our time horizon about when that optimism will happen. So how can you thrive with stress? How can you be in this environment that's so different in 2020 and actually, channel that stress to actually improve outcomes for clients, to really focus ourselves on delivering the best possible advice and service for clients? And it turns out that according to the research, whether or not stress has a negative effect on you largely has to do with your mindset about whether you think it is harmful. What do I mean by that? So Kelly McGonigal is the person who did the research on this, a fabulous book, The Upside of Stress. She also has a TED Talk if you prefer the sort of 15-minute nutshell version. And what she found, especially looking at cardiac issues, was that people who thought stress was bad for them tended to have negative health impacts from stress. But people who reframed stress and thought stress was actually good for them, it was a reminder that something was important, that they wanted to focus on it, actually didn't experience negative health consequences from stress. So how could that be? For example, we know athletes, right? When athletes, have that sort of, they're a little stressed before their performance, they're using strong visualization, they're getting ready for their race, whatever it is, they tend to perform better. It turns out that in negotiation, so if you do negotiation exercises, people who say they felt sort of stressed before the negotiation often get a better outcome. Students often taking a test, if they say they're a little stressed about the test, often will do better. Because that stress is a way of their brain saying, this is important, pay attention. Give your focus to this task because we care about the outcome. And the one that really surprised me was the medical profession. If a surgeon said to me, I'm feeling a little stressed today, I'd probably say, well, let's pass. You can do the surgery next week. It turns out they actually also get a better outcome. And so, one way to think about stress is not to focus on the stresses, killing me, because if you believe that, it literally is harming you physiologically. But to think of it as stress is a way of telling you that something is important to you and you want to do it well. And it's a way then, if you think about competence, to reflect back and say, well, do I have the capacity to do this? Because if I don't, then I should really be declining, this case, this matter, or bringing somebody else on board to help with it. So I think, her research is really quite interesting about this. I'll try to give you one other way to think about it. I'm going to use something that for many people I realize is a horror, which is public speaking. If I were to tell you, in 30 minutes, I want you to get up on the stage in front of 10,000 people and give a speech, for many of you, you would spiral into a bunch of self-talk about how I'm not good at public speaking, I'm so stressed, I'll never be able to do this. And the result is you have a negative outcome in the sense of it's physiologically harming to you. I, on the other hand, would be only 10,000, could you get me some more people? Because I'm so excited to sort of share the things that I've learned and to actually engage in discussion. One of the reasons it'll be so important for you to click that Zoom link at the end and join us for Q&A. So it turns out that for both sets of people, those who dread the public speaking, those who embrace it, the chemical cocktails released in the brain are the same. The brain can't tell the difference between I'm stressed and I'm excited. The chemical composition of those is essentially identical. And so what we label those feelings is essential to determining whether it's a way of focusing our attention or whether it's a way of causing us to perhaps have a negative health outcome as a result. Her research also found some other sort of interesting things about ways to think about this beyond sort of fight, flight, or freeze that we talked about earlier, which is some people look at stress and say it's a challenge, right? This is a challenge. Wow, this is going to be hard. I can't wait. And so if you have more of a growth mindset, if you're familiar with the mindset work by Carol Dweck, having that sort of feeling that it's a challenge actually means that there's usually not a negative outcome. And then the other way is some people under stress reach out to others and connect with others, sort of a tend and befriend response. which results in the release of chemicals that make you feel calmer and feel good. And so you often will see that response as well. So sugar research really indicates that there's some other options available to us if we're willing to think about what is our mindset about how that stress is impacting us. Now, every single one of you already knows 3 of the most important things you could do to help manage your lawyer well-being. The problem is that you often are not doing them or not doing them consistently. And so the 3 things for sort of optimal cognitive health would be eat, sleep, exercise, and repeat. And the reason that we don't do that is our prefrontal cortex consumes about 25% of the body's energy on average. And so it's always looking for shortcuts because it's making so many decisions, it's using so much of the heart's output, of your respiratory output, of your calories, that it's always looking for ways to save energy. And so, for example, if you want to eat more nutritiously, then you have to do meal planning and acquire nutritious ingredients and prepare the food in nutritious ways. All of those take prefrontal cortex resources. And so it's very easy for the brain to say, well, I'm depleted today, I need to save some resources, and then that falls to the bottom. Your brain is essentially sabotaging you because it's trying to save energy, and it's doing the very thing that will keep you from being sort of as healthy as you could be. So let me just give you a couple of examples. Tom Rath is the author of the book Strengths Finder 2.0, which said we should all focus more on our strengths than on trying to improve our areas of relative weakness. Has also written a book called Eat, Move, Sleep, which is a great book about how small changes can improve our lives, and has some great resources on his website. I think one way to think about this is fuel. Nutrition is fuel not just for our physical body, but also for our brain, right? Because it allows for us to be in that prefrontal cortex, and that's depleted if we're eating excess sugars and fats that basically stimulate release of dopamine and get us into a pattern where we continue to do that. So really being attuned, especially in this work from home environment, between do I need food or do I want food? And I think this is especially hard now that for most people, food is only a few steps away. In fact, you may actually be working in your kitchen. I think this is a really helpful way to think about it. Food is the most abused anxiety drug, and exercise is the most underutilized antidepressant. So exercise is a huge thing, as I've come to realize. Shaking my head in disbelief at 2020 is really not aerobic exercise. It's really not helping to improve my physical and cognitive well-being. I sometimes, I'm like that lawyer in Jurassic Park, I need a little motivation. And so exercise often is more effective if it's literally scheduled and if you do it with somebody else, sort of a built-in accountability factor. Kelly McGonigal, the author of the book, The Upside of Stress, just came out with a new book this year called The Joy of Movement. And she really advocates for combining sort of our movement, thinking of it as movement as opposed to exercise, but also using that as an opportunity to connect either with nature or with others. Like, so for example, socially distanced walking or bike riding. As a way to sort of build resilience. And so sort of getting a twofer, right? Not just the physical exercise, but also getting the release of dopamine and other things from being out with other people and from being in nature. And it turns out connecting to nature is also an extremely powerful way to improve our health. For much of my career, I thought sleep was for the weak. I think maybe that's especially true. The litigators think that. My actual personal goal for 2020 was to work on improving my sleep. And so 2020 has posed some unique challenges to that. There's some great books out there, and I've put a couple of my favorites here in the materials for you. But I think there are a couple of things about sleep deprivation. One is that as people get more senior, they are more protective of their sleep. And that's because sleep is critical to having the strong cognitive resources necessary for knowledge work, which is essentially what lawyers are. Sleep deprivation, I would have predicted, would be highest among high school and college age kids, but it turns out it's really people my age, the 45 to 54-year-old crowd, that gets the least sleep. And so really trying to focus on this area as an area for health and well-being. And one of the reasons for that sleep deficit is people using their devices at night, especially the 50% who are checking their email overnight. Don't do it. I have a separate talk that's available from the California Lawyers Association on how to focus in a distracted world. And one of the things that's really shocking there is I can tell you why you're addicted to checking your messages, but let me just assure you, no good email has ever come in the middle of the night. Whatever it is can wait until 7 a.m. Don't check your devices during the night. And then get a pet. I put this in this section because a lot of people are getting pets. This is actually my dog on the left side. This is my little puppy who listens to all of my presentations like this. And I particularly like the way dogs handle stress. If you can't eat it or play with it, pee on it and walk away. I'm not recommending that for lawyers because I don't want to hear weird assault things coming up and people being disciplined for them. But having pets is shown to be a stress reliever for a lot of people. It provides some of that social connection. It provides some of that tactile connection, and so not to shy away from that during this particular time. And again, the reason we don't follow this advice that we know is so good is because it takes prefrontal cortex resources. So a few pro tips: write it down. Better yet, if you just put it on your calendar that this is the time I exercise, because most lawyers do what the calendar tells them to do. So if the calendar says, go change and get on the treadmill, you're much more likely to do that. The other thing is if you write it down and put it someplace that's visible to others, or you literally share it with somebody so that you have an accountability partner, you're much more likely to engage in these kinds of pro-health behaviors. Emotional regulation, also really important during this time. And so back to this idea of what we label things being very, very important. So making sure that we check in with ourselves about what is the emotion that I'm feeling. And the process of labeling an emotion is a prefrontal cortex exercise. It takes us out of that emotional brain. It brings us into our prefrontal cortex. This can be very helpful if you are working with somebody and you're having trouble reading their emotional state, whether it's a coworker, whether it's a client. You wouldn't want to say to them, I can tell you're feeling angry. But what you can say is, it seems like you might be frustrated. Is that right? And asking that question requires them to come out of their emotional brain and then evaluate your statement in their prefrontal cortex and their thinking brain to say, is that in fact an accurate summation of what I'm feeling? And so really being careful about how we label things, I think very important all the time, but especially so now. And I'll give you one example that for me just really resonates, which is how many people tell me they're stuck at home. And for me, I'm safe at home. And that word difference means a lot because we tend to get stuck in self-talk that's repetitive. And I am safe at home, and that's a blessing. Not everyone can say that they're safe in their home. And so to really stop and think about the self-talk that we're engaged in, the way in which we're labeling the things around us can be critically important to thinking about our well-being right now as attorneys. Meditation. If you'd asked me a few years ago about meditation, I would have said sort of, weird, I wouldn't go for it. I think the peer-reviewed research is really overwhelming of the benefits of meditation or mindfulness meditation, which is one subset. I thought I would just share with you, there's a reason that breathing exercises work, and that is because when you take a few deep breaths, you are basically, your amygdala thinks that you have enough energy to run away or to fight whatever the threat is. So there's a really simple physiological reason why taking a deep breath helps us when we're under stress. In this particular kind of breathing meditation, in a study they just released last month, they found that it was the most beneficial of the ones they tested. Within a week, it normalized anxiety levels, and that there were continued benefits for almost a full year, just from a week's training and this particular kind of breath meditation. Probably the most widespread or most known is mindfulness meditation, meaning that you try to be aware in the present moment without judgment. And so many people practice mindfulness meditation. Only a few minutes a day is enough to increase gray matter brain density after 8 weeks, and that's related to, for example, long-term memory, and all of us could probably use some help with that. So even small amounts of regular meditation can show profound benefits. One of the areas that I'm particularly interested in is that people who are regular practitioners of mindfulness meditation, show decreased implicit bias on many different testing parameters of bias. And the thought is that they basically strengthen their without judgment muscle in a way that makes it less reactive. And so they become less biased. And so I think there are many different aspects of mindfulness meditation that can be helpful to us as attorneys in our practice, both from a competence perspective, health and wellness, and also from elimination of bias. These are two of the best books to get started, although it's not where I began my journey. I liked Meditation for Fidgety Skeptics, which I think more accurately described who I was when I started my meditation practice. There are, of course, many apps for this, and I want to point out, I know at least in Los Angeles County, they're offering a free app for a year for all Los Angeles County residents. I know that Kaiser offers one of these apps as a benefit, and many companies are now offering access to apps on mindfulness meditation as benefits. So you may want to look into that. If you want to know something about these, I'm happy to talk to you about sort of which ones are my personal favorites or which ones might best suit you. There's some other things, and again, I'm not trying to sell you any particular way. I'd like you to hopefully pick out one or two of these and give them a try. Coloring is really popular right now, adult coloring books. A lot of people like to have office stress toys. I find them a distraction, but some people really swear by them. I'm a big believer in desk yoga, so I actually use a small timer that I can flip upright to whatever number of minutes I want. I usually set mine for every 30 minutes so that I get up from my desk and do something. There's research that says even if you do like 10 jumping jacks once an hour, that increases your calorie burn the next day and improves your cholesterol. So it doesn't take much. But this is one of the challenges of being actually more sedentary since we're sheltering in place. So really important that we think about building movement into our everyday routines. What are a few other things? Self-compassion is huge. I'm a huge fan of Kristen Neff, obviously for books. She also has a TED Talk. You know, we say things to ourselves that we would never say to another human being. And right now, some of us are being so critical of what we're being able to do in this exceptionally challenging year of 2020, struggling with what we're already trying to do, often as lawyers wishing there was more that we could do to help in terms of society generally. And so to really be careful about how we are speaking to ourselves and to speak to ourselves with the same kindness and compassion with which we would speak to our clients or others, I think really critical in this year. You might want to think about your sense of purpose, being focused on what you do have control over, and reminding yourself to be flexible, because you know these are the best ways in which we can be resilient and model that we will get through this, is by taking control where we can and recognizing the need to be flexible moving forward. For me, this is sort of the slide that I would say print out and really take this to heart, because it captures a number of different ways. I used to caption this journaling, and I think I don't like keeping a journal because as a litigator, I'm like, if I write it down, somebody could discover it and use it against me. But I do think that this can be a really positive way to reflect on a given day. And so sort of each day, sort of, who did I help today? You're really thinking it might have been, a neighbor who needed to borrow something. It might have been a client. It might have been reaching out to a friend or colleague. What impact did I have on others today? Did I raise their spirits? Was I able to give them some good news? Was I able to help them make a difficult decision? What did I make progress on? I think lawyers were particularly prone to saying I didn't make any progress because we didn't get it all the way across the finish line. But really, what the research says, they did a study that included employees from many companies keeping journals of sort of what days at work were positive, and they correlated to making progress, even a little bit of progress on something. So really, don't be so wedded to looking at that task list and did it get crossed off, but more thinking about it as sort of Post-it notes moving across, the screen or the wall to get to Friday when it should get to done. It doesn't have to get done in a day for you to be able to say, yes, I made progress on that. Progress could be cleaning out one drawer. This is my new goal, is to clean one drawer a day of my house. Make it small, make it something you can do and have progress that's steady. And then what am I grateful for? I've actually noticed some people picking this up on Facebook, that on Fridays they post the things they're grateful for. That's actually one of my practices since I was a young lawyer, was to write 2 thank you notes every Friday before I shut down my computer back in the days when we did that every Friday. So to really think about what are the things that I'm grateful for, notwithstanding the challenges I face. So I think this is a great way to sort of model and get us focused on the things that are happening, where it reminds us that we have taken action, that we are making progress, and that there are things that are going well. And so I really encourage you to think about doing this. Yes, there are apps for this too, and if you need a recommendation, shoot me an email. I'd be happy, or ask me in the Q&A session, but there are apps that will actually prompt you for similar kinds of questions if you'd like. Take up a new hobby. Lots of people have taken up new hobbies. I think when we're in the Q&A session, be ready to share. I know lots of people, gardening's been very popular. So is the idea of making yeast-based breads and all that, kneading and tactile effort that goes into it. At my house, it was cooking. I've cooked more in the past 6 months than I probably had in my entire life. And as I like to say, many have eaten here and few have died, because I found myself cooking for 5 young men who are all in their early 20s for most of the pandemic so far, which has been a whole new experience for me. I also decided, for example, one of my hobbies is I try to find a fun meme per day to sort of track my thoughts, both good and bad, through COVID. So I started out with sort of discovering all of the natural hair colors of many of my colleagues in the early day of the coronavirus, all the way to back in my day, there was enough toilet paper that we would hang it in the trees of our enemies. Something that young people today have no idea what this refers to. So just trying to find new hobbies that are fun, having a fabulous playlist. It's actually interesting. I've encountered some other lawyer organizations that do have shared playlists they've created on Spotify. So I just throw that out there if that's something that the Contra Costa County Bar Association would like to do. But you might think about having yourself a great playlist. Staying connected. So that idea of tending with friends, really important. Volunteer match.org will match you to volunteer opportunities that you can do from home. One of the great things about volunteering is it reminds us of just how capable and competent we are, while giving us that sense of social connection that can be so important to well-being, especially if you're battling loneliness right now. And then finally, gratitude. Having a robust practice about recognizing the things we're grateful for can have tremendous health and wellness benefits. So when I sort of think about final thoughts in this area, a couple of things. I'd encourage you to reflect on this and choose 1, 2, 3 ideas that you'd be willing to try. And then I'd like you to write it down as an if-then statement, right? So, if I'm feeling lonely, then I'm going to reach out to somebody in my contacts list. Or, if I want to sleep better, then I'm going to quit using my devices at 10 p.m. every night. The reason I say to write an if-then statement is what we want to do to create a new behavior, we need to cue the brain to the situation where when this happens, that's what I want to remember to do, right? So if I want to go to the kitchen for a snack, then I'm first going to clean through one drawer and see if I'm really hungry. So you want to write an if-then statement to cue your brain so that when a particular scenario presents itself, you've already figured out, you've already used your prefrontal cortex to figure out what it is that you want to do or try so that you begin to do or try that. You need to choose one, write one if-then statement, maybe write 2 or 3, pick one, work on that for 28 days. What you want to do is get yourself some small, quick wins, that progress piece. It takes about 28 days to create a new habit. Then you can go back and look and pick your second one up and try for that one. So don't try to do all of these at once. Try to just do one, do it well for a month, lock in some small gains, and then keep going. Remember, it's not the load that breaks you down, it's the way you carry it. And that's a lot of what we've talked about is the load is heavy. Really acknowledge that suffering, that what's unusual this year is a form of suffering. And then remember, you don't have to carry it. You don't have to carry it all the time. There are plenty of other people available to help you to do that. And you should ask for help and rethink your relationship to that particular stress. And then finally, I think this is for me one of the most impactful articles that I have read, which is sort of how you cultivate well-being over time. And in this particular article, Jennifer Akers' research said, look backward, try to protect your special memories. Think about your scrapbook, doing your oral history, calling family members you haven't talked to. Look forward and think about what are the life experiences that you still want to have once we emerge from this pandemic. What are the things that are going to be meaningful that you still want to experience in life? And then look outward. What am I doing that improves my community, that enhances the well-being of others? Interestingly enough, these are not the kinds of things that you see a lot in the literature and a lot of the techniques that we've used, but they are three things that are really shown to improve people's overall well-being over the long haul. And so again, I'd encourage you to reflect on those three things as a way to focus on that, giving meaning to the current situation and to where you want to head in the future. So I really appreciate that you gave me this opportunity to speak with all of you at your MCLE event. I'm very hopeful that you'll click on the link and come and join us for some Q&A to share your hobbies, to share techniques that you're using that work, to ask any questions that you may have. And with that, I'll toss it back to you, Anne.
Thank you so much, Michelle. That was just amazing. I've been breathing a lot during the program and petting my dog, so I can endorse both of those activities, but it's all very important, and I'd like to thank you for giving all that information to us today in such a compassionate and thoughtful way. Everyone, I'm Ann Wolf. I'm the Education and Events Director of the Contra Costa Bar Association. And again, thank you, Michelle, for being with us today. You're now invited to join a live Q&A session with Michelle. Below the screen on which you are viewing this session is the link that will take you directly to the live Q&A session. As a reminder, the materials and evaluation forms for this program can be downloaded from the session page. There's a tab above the chat that says Files. Please fill out the evaluation form you find there, and you can send it directly to me. Your attendance certificates will be available soon. If you are a CCCBA member, your attendance certificate will be on our website in your member profile under the My Events tab. If you are a non-member or would like more information on how to get your attendance certificate, that information will be in the FAQ tab on the main page. So coming up next today, after the break at 12:30, will be our plenary keynote with Novella Coleman, who is the Director of Litigation for Bay Area Legal Aid. She's going to be talking about examining racial bias at the intersection of housing and policing. Now, this program is being sponsored by ADR Services, Inc. At 2:30 this afternoon, please join us for our live law firm marketing forum with Kara Pryor of James Marketing Amplifier and Terry Leone and Erica McKenna. Also, don't forget, from 1:30 to 3:30, please visit the sponsor rooms. Their meeting rooms will be open, and the section networking rooms will also be open. Then at 4 p.m., we have 2 more MCLE programs to choose from today. One is another elimination of bias program, Embracing Invisible Disabilities. Or you can also learn about COVID bankruptcies and the Small Business Reorganization Act. So I want to encourage everyone to also join us later for our evening program. You heard from our magician. We'll be having a comic and some cow shakes performances for you. Those should be very fun and very interesting. For any and all technical difficulties, please head again to the FAQ tab. There's some troubleshooting tips there. And now I would like to invite you to please click the link below and join the live Q&A session with Michelle. Hope to see you all there.